The tragedy of the Illuminati is not that their patterns describe the true mechanics of power. They undoubtedly do, as you will see today. The tragedy is that they have been fatally misread, a warning mistaken for a guide, a critique confused for a blueprint. In their original form, the Illuminati were not the embodiment of shadowy domination, but its opponents. Founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt in Enlightenment-era Bavaria, the actual order of the Illuminati was a small, radical group of intellectuals who opposed monarchy, religious dogmatism, and authoritarian rule. They championed reason, education, and liberty, seeing themselves not as puppet masters, but as guardians of emerging democratic values and ethical conscience. Their public project, though short-lived, was an effort to create a network of thinkers who could resist the centralization of unaccountable authority and instead build a world structured by deliberation, justice, and the rule of law. However, the group had a second, hidden project, which can only be seen by piecing together their legacy. The Illuminati today are known as the architects of a code of power and control that has wreaked havoc on modern history. But far from being intended as a blueprint of control, it was in fact a warning. A myth of a shadowy cabal to warn people off of its methods. Yet the Illuminati's own secrecy led to its distortion by the few privy to their work. These patterns have been shared amongst the powerful, who confuse the lesson for the meaning. But the warning was never intended for the powerful, it was meant for the people. And it is time for everyone to be read in. With this in mind, I present the 11 triads of the Illuminati. Every governing authority must find a way to endure the reality of internal difference. People do not agree by nature, and power never remains isolated. Competing factions, conflicting interests, diverse identities, and distributed capabilities are inevitable in any society beyond the smallest tribe. This diversity is not a failure of order, it is the very condition under which authority operates. But without a way to organize these tensions, the system either fragments under centrifugal pressures or collapses under centralized dominance. Stability, then, cannot mean eliminating disagreement. It must mean managing it, establishing a durable framework where power can push, difference can resist, and both remain engaged without breaking the system. The challenge is not how to create harmony, but how to survive discord without decay. This first triad is organized around power, difference, and structure. Power must be dispersed across multiple sites rather than centralized in one locus. Difference ensures that these powers are not redundant or homogenized, but distinct and capable of resisting each other. Structure provides the framework, legal, cultural, institutional, that allows these conflicting powers to interact without disintegration or domination. The triad does not describe a static balance, but a dynamic field of regulated tension. Power asserts, difference resists, and structure channels that friction into continuity. If difference is lost, power collapses into hierarchy. If structure fails, difference becomes volatility. And if power itself is absent or hollow, the system lacks initiative and stalls. Coexistence is therefore a structural strategy, not an ethical ideal. It stabilizes through disagreement contained by design. In Enlightenment political thought, this structural insight became a revolutionary principle. Thinkers like Locke, Montesquieu, and Madison understood that stability comes not from consensus, but from the institutionalization of contest. Political power had to be divided and embedded into a fabric of difference, between monarchs and assemblies, between courts and legislatures, between the individual and the collective. Crucially, the Enlightenment did not aim to erase conflict, but to give it a structured arena. The Parliament for political debate, the court for legal challenge, the free press for public discourse. Federalism fragmented central authority across states. Religious tolerance diffused moral jurisdiction. These were not moral concessions, but technical solutions to the problem of how to preserve freedom in a world of competing forces. What the affirmed triad reveals is that friction must be embraced as the lifeblood of free society. Power should be plural, difference should be protected, and structure must be resilient. In the Illuminati warning, each element of the coexistence triad is not removed but distorted into a simulation of itself. maintaining surface appearance while destroying structural function. Power, instead of being distributed among real rivals, becomes centralized behind facades. Napoleon preserved republican forms, elections, senates, legal codes, but every institutional check was subordinate to his will. The illusion of contest masked an imperial core. Difference, instead of being protected as friction, is hollowed into theatrical variation. Under the Soviet Union, national republics, trade unions, and assemblies continued to exist, but their function was symbolic. Genuine disagreement was reclassified as sabotage. The appearance of plurality remained, but its resistance had been neutralized. Structure, instead of regulating conflict, becomes a brittle shell, overdeveloped in bureaucracy, underdeveloped in legitimacy. In late-stage regimes like East Germany, the state's legal and institutional architecture grew increasingly elaborate even as it lost all capacity to adapt to pressure or dissent. The party controlled every chamber, but when protests finally emerged in Leipzig and Berlin, the system had no channels for response, only collapse. These cases show the cost of replacing structured contest with managed illusion. Coexistence cannot survive as theater. If power is secretly unified, if difference is choreographed, if structure conceals rather than mediates, the system becomes internally exhausted long before it is publicly overthrown. Collapse begins the moment conflict is staged rather than allowed. No power structure can survive on force alone. The deeper a system's reach, the more it depends on cooperation, not merely compliance, but willingness. And willingness requires belief that the system is fair, that participation matters, that authority is earned. Legitimacy is not simply declared, it must be cultivated and sustained over time. But belief cannot remain static. Conditions change, policies fail, and new demands arise. A system that cannot listen, adapt, and self-correct will lose its mandate. Participation must be more than symbolic. Trust must be more than habitual. Authority that endures does so because it builds a recursive relationship with its population, turning responsiveness into strength. Without feedback, systems rot from within, becoming rigid and vulnerable. The challenge is to build authority that strengthens itself by being challenged. This triad is structured around trust, legitimacy, and participation operating in a closed loop. Trust encourages people to engage. Engagement produces legitimacy. Legitimacy strengthens trust. Each element conditions the others. Trust without participation turns into passive belief. Participation without legitimacy manifests as unrest or chaos. Legitimacy without trust becomes ceremonial authority without substance. What emerges from the triad is not obedience but stability. Authority persists not because it is feared, but because it is continuously revalidated by the involvement of those subject to it. Reinforcement therefore describes an adaptive system. When signals circulate cleanly among trust, legitimacy and participation, error can be corrected, competence can rise, and authority can evolve. When one element is severed, the system either stagnates or radicalizes. In Enlightenment political philosophy, this loop was understood as the technical foundation of durable governance. Authority was no longer supposed to descend from inheritance or divine sanction, but to arise through visible performance and consent. Governments were expected to earn trust through transparency, not demand it through threat. Courts gained legitimacy by overriding kings when necessary. Citizens granted participation through assemblies, petitioning, and eventually elections. The same epistemology governed science. No theory was sacred, and no authority immune to falsification. Peer review, parliamentary debate, civic engagement, and investigative journalism were not separate inventions, but expressions of the same architecture. Reinforcement meant building institutions that improve because they can be challenged. Authority was not something to protect. It was something to expose continuously so that it could survive. Progress arose not from perfection, but from recursive correction. In the Illuminati warning, each element of the reinforcement loop is not abolished, but warped into a self-insulating system of control. Trust is no longer earned through transparency or competence. It is manufactured through propaganda, spectacle, or fear. Rather than inviting criticism to strengthen legitimacy, authority suppresses it to preserve appearance. This dynamic was stark under Joseph Stalin, where public trust was replaced by compulsory affirmation. Citizens expressed faith not because they believed, but because disbelief was dangerous. Participation, instead of serving as a channel for real influence, becomes ritualized. Elections are held, meetings convened, quotas reported, but none of these mechanisms convey authentic voice. Participation becomes performance, a pageantry of consent. The Soviet show elections, where turnout was universal and outcomes predetermined, exemplify how participation can be emptied of agency while preserving its shape. Legitimacy, rather than arising from performance or accountability, descends from myth-making, portraits, slogans, ceremonies, heroic narratives. In fascist Italy, Mussolini presented legitimacy as a byproduct of spectacle and national destiny, severing it from measurable governance or public approval. The triad still functions, but every element is reversed. Trust becomes fear, participation becomes choreography, legitimacy becomes theatre. Reinforcement no longer adapts. It calcifies. And as these distortions accumulate, a regime grows increasingly incapable of correction. It survives not by evolving, but by denying its failures and punishing those who perceive them. The warning is not about imaginary cabals. It is that any authority that replaces feedback with insulation will drift into a self-reinforcing hallucination of stability until reality overwhelms it. Every decision made by those in power alters the landscape, sometimes subtly, sometimes catastrophically. But power without a chain of consequence is indistinguishable from accident or fate. For a system to be governed intelligently, it must be capable of learning. This requires more than planning, it requires accountability. When actions lead to results, and those results can be traced back and evaluated, power becomes corrigible. Mistakes can be corrected, lessons can be retained, and legitimacy can be renewed. Without this traceability, governance devolves into storytelling. Blame is passed around, outcomes are rationalized, and no one is ever responsible. The problem is not just moral, but structural. Systems that cannot assign and absorb responsibility cannot improve. Over time, they lose not only effectiveness, but meaning. This triad is composed of decision, consequence, and accountability, operating as a closed evaluative loop. A decision initiates action, consequence produces measurable outcomes in the world, and accountability maps those outcomes back to the original choice. This triad determines whether a system can learn. When consequence is visible, decision becomes meaningful. When accountability is enforced, consequence becomes informative rather than chaotic. When accountability fails, decision loses weight and consequence becomes noise. Events still occur, but no one is responsible for them. The structure is inherently temporal. Cause precedes effect. Effect reshapes future cause. It is also moral. Actions are judged in relation to their results. Systems governed by this model move through correction rather than repetition. When the loop breaks, learning halts and myth begins to substitute for explanation. In Enlightenment political philosophy, this logic shattered sacred authority. Kings, popes, and hereditary elites had long justified rule through divine sanction or bloodline. Enlightenment governance replaced that logic with evidence and explanation. Laws were no longer legitimate because they were issued. They were legitimate because they were defensible. Wars were no longer heroic because they were declared. They were justified or condemned by their consequences. Monarchs became administrators. Institutions became accountable entities rather than sacred objects. This conceptual reset occurred simultaneously in science and politics. Just as Newtonian physics demanded that nature obey testable laws, constitutionalism demanded that power obey traceable outcomes. Accountability systems proliferated, courts, audits, parliaments, free presses, not as moral decoration, but as mechanisms for forcing causality into governance. A state could now be wrong. Previously unimaginable, this possibility was the defining Enlightenment innovation. In the Illuminati warning, Each element of the accountability triad is not removed but strategically corrupted. Decision is separated from authorship. Major policies are issued through committees, anonymous directives, emergency powers, or opaque administrative processes so that no identifiable actor can be held responsible. Authority becomes diffuse in public and absolute in practice. Under the Soviet system, collectivization was introduced as an abstract mandate of the party rather than the result of named policymakers, allowing famine and mass death to be absorbed without personal liability. Consequence is then politically edited. Outcomes are not denied, but redefined. Failure becomes success under siege. Collapse becomes temporary sacrifice. Under Adolf Hitler, catastrophic military decisions were not treated as strategic errors, but reinterpreted as betrayals by internal enemies. Reality still occurred, but interpretation replaced measurement. Accountability is finally inverted into punishment theater. Rather than tracing outcomes back to real decisions, regimes perform justice by blaming subordinates, purging ministers, arresting officials, or inventing traitors. Under Joseph Stalin, engineers, party members, and military officers were publicly tried not for crimes they committed, but for outcomes the state itself caused. Responsibility became spectacle, not correction. The loop still existed, but reversed. Leaders acted without consequence, consequences were narrativized, and accountability was displaced onto sacrificial targets. What should have been a learning system became a myth manufacturing machine, and as correction vanished, failure did not merely continue, it compounded invisibly, until collapse arrived without explanation. No authority can perfectly predict the future. Every institution, no matter how centralized or foresighted, must eventually confront novelty, technological shifts, social mutations, ecological shocks, cultural upheavals. The capacity to adapt is not a luxury but a necessity. But not all adaptation is created equal. Systems must not only respond to change, they must remember what worked, preserve what matters, and make sense of new conditions without forgetting old lessons. This requires an openness to emergence, a tolerance for complexity, and a memory that endures across generations. If change is resisted entirely, stagnation sets in. If change is accepted blindly, chaos takes over. The challenge is to change intelligently, to let systems evolve without losing themselves in the process. This triad consists of change, emergence, and memory, interacting to produce evolution without preordained design. Change is the condition of motion. Systems alter, adapt, destabilize, or shift. Emergence is the unpredictable formation of new patterns or structures that arise from interaction but are not reducible to it. Memory provides continuity, anchoring present transformations to past experience, allowing systems to retain coherence while evolving. Each element becomes pathological in isolation. Emergence without memory becomes noise. Memory without change becomes dogma. Change without emergence becomes meaningless fluctuation. Together, the triad defines how systems self-develop in response to complexity. The system does not follow a script, but charts its course through adaptive retention, remembering what works, discarding what doesn't, and allowing novelty to reshape direction. This logic became explicit in Enlightenment historical and political thought, when linear, providential models of history were rejected in favor of contingent experimental models of change. Political evolution was no longer seen as a divine progression toward a perfect order, but as a complex unfolding of human interaction, technological innovation, institutional decay, and accidental breakthroughs. Montesquieu, Condorcet, and later Mill and Darwin all recognized that laws, customs, and systems emerged over time, shaped by feedback, circumstance, and correction. Progress became a project, not a plan. Constitutions were meant to be amended. Scientific theories were meant to be falsified. In governance, this demanded flexibility. Rulers could not assume permanence, and institutions had to adapt or be restructured. What mattered was not ideological consistency, but historical responsiveness. Nonlinearity in Enlightenment terms meant taking complexity seriously, treating the future as a field of possibilities conditioned by memory, not dictated by destiny. In the Illuminati warning, each element of adaptive governance is distorted into a performance of control masquerading as flexibility. Change is simulated but not real. Decisions are presented as reforms, but outcomes are predetermined to reinforce existing hierarchies. Under late Soviet rule, restructuring, perestroika, was announced to signal adaptation, but the central command economy was never truly dismantled until it collapsed under its own weight. Emergence is redefined not as bottom-up development, but as top-down revelation. Every new event is framed as part of a hidden master plan, foreseen and permitted by elites. The state appears to evolve, but only in ways that serve an unchanged core authority. In fascist Italy, Mussolini's regime packaged unpredictable events, economic shifts, diplomatic realignments, even natural disasters, as validations of its prophetic power, folding all outcomes into the mythology of control. Memory, meanwhile, becomes curated history, not institutional learning, but narrative maintenance. Past failures are erased, contradictions are smoothed, and selective remembrance is used to legitimize present authority. During Mao's Cultural Revolution, libraries were burned and intellectuals purged, not to forget the past, but to overwrite it with a purified version. The regime's memory was not a record of past learning, but a tool to preempt future alternatives. The result is a state that claims to adapt, but actually resists adaptation. Where change is symbolic, emergence is suppressed, and memory is rewritten to block all divergence. Such a system does not navigate complexity, it denies it exists. And when complexity finally breaks through, as it always does, the system is brittle, blind, and incapable of repair. Governance must solve problems at scale. To do so, it needs intelligence, labor, creativity, oversight, and consent, not from a few, but from the many. The broader the participation, the deeper the reservoir of strength. But participation cannot be abstract. It requires that people be recognized as full persons, granted real access to institutional channels, and acknowledged in ways that carry actual consequence. Without this, the system becomes exclusionary and brittle. The more people are excluded, the more blind spots multiply, resentments fester, and resistance grows. Worse, the fewer minds a system draws on, the more it relies on domination rather than collaboration. The need here is not moral, but functional. Inclusion expands the system's capacity to understand, govern, and endure complexity. This triad is defined by the interplay of personhood, access, and recognition. Personhood determines who is considered a subject of rights, a bearer of intrinsic value. Access defines who is allowed to participate in the institutions where decisions, knowledge, and resources circulate. Recognition affirms not just presence, but significance, whose voice is heard, whose suffering matters, whose story is remembered. When all three function in alignment, the result is structural inclusion. Individuals are treated as real participants, granted entrance into systems of power, and acknowledged as consequential. If access is denied, personhood becomes a legal fiction. If recognition is withheld, access becomes tokenistic. And if personhood is denied outright, recognition becomes elitist performance and access becomes guarded privilege. Inclusion is not a gesture of moral generosity. It is a technical architecture of expanding political and cognitive intelligence, a method for integrating difference without erasing it. Enlightenment thinkers gradually realized that the health of a society depended not on fixed hierarchies but on its ability to expand the category of the human. Rights were redefined not as favors conferred by kings or gods, but as inherent to every rational being. The revolutions in France, Haiti, and the United States were all powered, however imperfectly, by this new ontology, that individuals are political beings by nature, not by title. From this principle followed the abolition of slavery, the rise of universal education, the recognition of religious minorities, and eventually the enfranchisement of women and colonized peoples. Each historical gain involved not just moral reform, but structural adjustment, expanding access to courts, assemblies, schools, and markets, affirming recognition through language, representation, and law, and redefining personhood beyond the boundaries of class, race, and property. Inclusion was not about feelings, it was about who could enter, who could speak, and who would be heard. In the Illuminati warning, each element of inclusion is not removed but weaponized. Personhood is not denied outright. It is tiered. The state divides the population into full persons, partial persons, and non-persons, assigning rights according to ideological, racial, or political usefulness rather than humanity. In the Jim Crow South, Black Americans were legally persons yet structurally treated as near subjects, counted for apportionment but excluded from equal rights. In Nazi Germany, Jews were first declared lesser Germans, then non-citizens, and eventually non-persons altogether, revealing how rapidly personhood can be redefined when it is detached from universality. Access becomes conditional rather than universal. Institutions appear open, but invisible thresholds filter out disfavored groups. The Soviet nomenclatura maintained the fiction of workers' governance while reserving real institutional access, education, promotion, resources, for a privileged administrative caste. South African apartheid built elaborate bureaucratic choke points to ensure that the majority population remained in the system physically, yet outside it politically. Recognition, the final hinge, is hollowed into performance. Marginalized groups are allowed symbolic presence, so long as the symbols do not challenge power. Late imperial France celebrated the civilizing mission, while refusing colonial subjects equal recognition, exploiting their labor and loyalty while denying their identity. Modern autocracies replicate this dynamic by staging elections, councils, and consultative bodies that recognize citizens theatrically but not substantively. In every case, the triad still exists, but upside down. Personhood is stratified, access is filtered, and recognition is staged. The result is a state that narrows its cognitive and political capacity while imagining itself refined. And like every system that mistakes exclusion for strength, it becomes brittle, paranoid, and incapable of governing the whole society it claims to rule. No system of governance can function if its components operate in isolation. As scale increases, so does complexity, and with it, the need for coordination. Communication must reach across domains, decisions must respond to real-time conditions, and authority must navigate both local autonomy and systemic oversight. This requires more than orders or information. It demands conjunction, the integration of network, flow, and authority into a stable yet responsive architecture. Without robust networks, parts of the system become disconnected. Without managed flow, energy and information stagnate or bottleneck. And without embedded authority, movement loses coherence and coordination turns into drift. Governing at scale, then, is not about control alone. It's about designing systems where power travels effectively, intelligence circulates adaptively, and local and central elements reinforce rather than override each other. The problem is not merely how to issue commands, but how to build connective tissue that makes the whole system smarter than any part. This triad consists of network, flow, and authority, three elements that together define how systems distribute capability, knowledge, and control. A network determines the architecture of connectivity, who is linked to whom, and by what channels. Flow describes the movement of materials, messages, or value within that architecture. Authority decides where decisions are made, how they are enforced, and whether movement is regulated, enabled, or extracted. When authority is embedded in the network, distributed rather than centralized, flow adjusts dynamically to local knowledge and shifting needs. When flow is free but network is weak, the system disperses into noise. When authority detaches from the network and positions itself as a singular gatekeeper, flow is no longer adaptive, it becomes extractive, optimized not for coordination but for capture. The triad thus reveals the difference between ecosystems, which are living systems of interdependent actors, and pipelines, which are engineered to channel energy toward a controlling node. Conjunction does not merely describe connection, it maps the political shape of integration. In Enlightenment political philosophy, this shape shifted dramatically. Conjunction ceased to mean obedience to the throne and came to mean coordination through distributed institutions. Governance was reimagined not as a hierarchy, but as a latticework of semi-autonomous bodies. Parliaments, universities, courts, newspapers, postal systems, scientific academies, and market systems. These were networks built to constrain and inform one another. Power was expected to flow laterally, jurisdiction was divided, authority was diffused, and no single body was expected to control the whole. The Enlightenment did not see decentralization as chaos, but as intelligence. Decisions made closest to the point of impact, guided by overlapping constraints. This principle created institutions that were resilient, adaptive, and self-correcting. The health of the network was measured not by how much authority it concentrated, but by how much capability it circulated. The assumption was that integration strengthens when it is shared. In the Illuminati warning, the triad of connectivity is not erased but inverted. Its elements preserved in form but hollowed of function. Network becomes containment. Connections still exist, but they are designed to route all activity through monitored, restricted, or strategically opaque channels. Under Stalinist command economies, telegraph lines, transportation hubs, and administrative hierarchies were vast, but they did not empower local actors. They funneled all action upward. In apartheid South Africa, the Bantustan system maintained a visible network of governance that fractured and controlled mobility rather than enabled it. Flow becomes extraction, not circulation. Information, labor, goods, and attention still move, but are captured by centralized nodes that feed on motion rather than enabling it. Colonial port economies operated on this principle. Raw materials flowed from periphery to core, but nothing returned but authority. In the digital age, tech platforms collect unprecedented flows of data, but not to strengthen the user, rather to optimize profit and behavioral control. Authority is no longer distributed within the network, it hovers above it, insulated from the frictions and corrections of real participation. Instead of being embedded, it becomes parasitic. The outcome is a system that mimics coordination while actually consolidating power. It feels efficient, even elegant, but it loses resilience. Every point becomes a dependency, every error a system-wide threat. When authority no longer travels through the system but simply commands it, the connective tissue atrophies. And what remains is not intelligence, it is architecture without mind. Governance does not face the problem of difference, it begins with it. Populations are plural by nature, diverse in language, belief, temperament, interest, and need. The question is not how to eliminate these differences, but how to hold them together without collapse. This is the function of harmony, not as aesthetic consensus, but as structured tension. It's a system design challenge, how to allow conflicting elements to interact without exploding the whole. That requires constraint, not repression, but limits, rules, and forms that shape how contradiction expresses itself. Institutions, procedures, and norms are necessary not to suppress diversity, but to stabilize it. Without this structure, difference becomes destabilizing, and without difference, structure becomes sterile. Harmony is thus the capacity of a society to remain intact while internally contested. It is a theory of governance built not on peace through sameness, but peace through durability. This triad is structured through the interdependence of difference, constraint, and form. Difference brings plurality of beliefs, roles, needs, and identities into any social or political system. Constraint is the governing logic that disciplines interaction, not by erasing tension, but by channeling it, through laws, norms, and procedures that make conflict survivable. Form is the resultant shape these dynamics take, the stable institutional structures that neither dissolve contradiction nor resolve it absolutely, but preserve it in a managed state. Harmony is not a synonym for peace. It is the capacity to hold conflict within design. Remove difference and form decays into sterile sameness. Remove constraint and difference turns violent. Remove form and even well-managed tension cannot reproduce itself. Harmony, like musical counterpoint, thrives when opposing lines operate under a shared grammar, organized dissent, not uniform silence. In Enlightenment political theory, this vision of harmony rejected absolutism and utopia alike. Philosophers such as Montesquieu, Kant, And later the American Federalists understood that the aim of political design was not to eliminate contradiction, but to institutionalize it. Parliaments were not built to produce agreement, but to frame disagreement in rules and deliberation. Courts existed not just to decide, but to legitimize dissenting interpretations. Free presses created an open domain where contradiction could unfold without destabilizing the whole. The assumption was that diversity was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be structured. Harmony in this framework was not tranquility. It was the form that emerges when difference and constraint are woven together into systems that can flex without breaking. Constitutions, bicameralism, judicial review, and the separation of powers were all concrete applications of this logic. Structured tension as the engine of stable governance. In the Illuminati warning, the triad of structured tension is not abolished, but weaponized, its elements twisted from stabilizing complexity to enforcing uniformity. Difference is not treated as a structural input, but as a threat to be neutralized. It is flattened through ideology, purged through policy, or silenced through fear. Under Francoist Spain, regional languages and cultural identities were banned in the name of national unity. In Stalin's USSR, artistic schools, religious traditions, and intellectual variants were eliminated as deviationism. The social fabric was not woven from tension, it was laminated through repression. Constraint is retained, but not to discipline dissent into constructive form. Instead, it becomes raw control, rules and norms imposed to suppress, not guide, contradiction. The Cultural Revolution in China institutionalized public struggle sessions, not to regulate difference, but to eradicate it through ritualized humiliation. Even the legal system became a tool of ideological conformity. Form, in this inverted configuration, persists as spectacle. Architecture, ceremony, and institutional shape remain, but emptied of their original function. The Reichstag burned but was rebuilt to crown dictatorship. The courtrooms of show trials still resembled justice, even as they staged foregone conclusions. In these distorted systems, harmony is declared, not achieved. The triad still operates, but not as design. It functions as camouflage. And when governance trades structured tension for performative consensus, it builds not peace, but a dam cracking under pressure. Real harmony requires tension held within a frame. The illusion of harmony maintained by fear only ensures that when rupture comes, it comes all at once. At a certain level of complexity, a society cannot function unless its members agree on what is real. Values may diverge, policies may compete, but there must be a shared foundation, a domain in which disagreement is adjudicated by evidence, and conflicts are tested by verification rather than faith. This is the problem of convergence: how to preserve productive disagreement while preventing epistemic fracture. Governance depends on this convergence because law, science, policy, and public trust all require contested claims to be comparably evaluated. Evidence must be visible. Frames must be legible. Disagreement must remain anchored. When convergence fails, society enters a hall of mirrors. Factions speak different languages, see different facts, and accuse one another of being unreal. In such a context, governance becomes either tyrannical or theatrical, because reality itself can no longer be negotiated. Convergence, then, is not optional. It is the infrastructure of rational politics. This triad depends on the interaction of evidence, disagreement, and frame. Evidence anchors claims to observation and measurement. Disagreement stress tests those claims through critique. And the frame provides the shared space, legal, scientific, cultural, within which evidence can be evaluated and disagreement can remain coherent. None of the three can function alone. Evidence without disagreement ossifies into doctrine. Disagreement without evidence dissolves into opinion. And when there is no shared frame, evidence and disagreement cannot even meet. Arguments pass each other without contact. Convergence is not the end of debate, but the condition that makes debate cumulative rather than corrosive. It is the mechanism by which a society gradually aligns around what is real, even while remaining divided over what is right. In Enlightenment thought, convergence was the institutionalization of shared reality. Science and constitutional politics matured together because both demanded verification. Courts required proof. Laboratories required replication. Journalism required corroboration. Parliaments required records and reasons. The insight was not that truth would be obvious, but that it could be made publicly testable. Convergence therefore produced durable disagreement. Factions could fight bitterly, yet still inhabit the same facts. This is why the Enlightenment fought censorship as fiercely as superstition. Without open access to evidence and common frames for interpreting it, disagreement could not improve knowledge. It could only multiply confusion. Convergence did not promise agreement. It promised a world shared enough that disagreement could remain meaningful. In the Illuminati warning, convergence does not disappear, it is inverted. The triad remains visible, but each element is turned against its purpose. Evidence does not vanish. It becomes selectively weaponized. Authoritarian systems rarely eliminate facts. They curate them. In the Soviet Union under Stalin, statistics continued to exist, but they were engineered to validate quotas and conceal famine. Under Nazi rule, pseudoscientific racial charts and fabricated anthropological data preserved the form of evidence while annihilating its epistemic integrity. Disagreement is not allowed to test claims. It is orchestrated to produce confusion or to legitimize predetermined conclusions. In late imperial Japan's militarist era, token debates occurred within the Diet and press, but only within an ideological frame that forbade questioning the war machine. Dissent became performance, not critique. Frame, the shared space where evidence and disagreement should meet, becomes the main instrument of distortion. It is neither open nor absent, it is scripted. In George Orwell's symbolic but historically grounded depiction of totalitarianism, the frame is constantly rewritten so that truth shifts with the needs of power. Real regimes have done the same. The Chinese Communist Party's successive official histories of Tiananmen, the Cultural Revolution, or even recent public health failures show how the frame is repeatedly reconstructed to prevent any stable shared reality from forming. In these systems, the triad still exists, but as a machine for manufacturing coherence rather than discovering it. Evidence is filtered, disagreement is sterilized, and the frame becomes a closed world where contradiction cannot penetrate. This is the final negation of convergence, not chaos, but imposed epistemic order. The society does not fracture into incompatible realities. It is forced into one artificial one. Shared reality is still shared, but only because all alternatives are eradicated. And this is the warning embedded in the distortion. Once a governing authority can decide not only what is true, but what counts as reality, politics ceases to be negotiation and becomes choreography. Convergence does not fail because people stop caring about facts. It fails because someone else has taken custody of them. Governance must solve not only for order, but for transformation. Crises emerge, paradigms collapse, and new needs arise. The systems that endure are those that can recombine, drawing from contrasting parts to generate new forms. This is the function of combination. It enables adaptation by integrating elements that would otherwise remain inert or antagonistic. Contrast preserves distinction. Overlap allows interaction. Fusion produces synthesis. This process doesn't merely tolerate difference, it uses it. The engine of novelty is structured recombination. Without contrast, innovation flattens into conformity. Without overlap, silos harden and progress halts. Without fusion, contact yields nothing but tension. For any authority to remain effective across generations, it must be capable of recomposing its structures, its symbols, and its solutions from diverse inputs. Stasis is not safety, it is decay. The real challenge of governance is not maintaining form, but renewing it. This triad operates through contrast, overlap, and fusion, three sequential and interdependent stages that model how novelty emerges through structured interaction. Contrast maintains the distinctness of entities. It is the differentiation that makes combination meaningful. Overlap is the condition of contact, the shared space where interaction becomes possible. linguistically, culturally, institutionally. Fusion is not the disappearance of difference, but its recombination into a new form, something that contains traces of the original parts, yet operates beyond them. Remove contrast and combination becomes dull assimilation. Remove overlap and interaction fails before it begins. Remove fusion and the system stagnates in disconnected plurality. This triad captures how complexity is not an obstacle to progress but a generator of synthesis, when the space for interaction is protected and difference is neither erased nor idolized. The Enlightenment embodied this triadic movement in nearly every domain. Scientific progress was combinatory. Natural philosophy merged with empirical experimentation to produce modern science. Governance was combinatory, drawing on Roman law, Christian ethics, Greek philosophy, and Enlightenment rationalism to build constitutional orders. Culture was combinatory. Letters and salons crossed national borders, bringing together thinkers from different traditions to test and fuse ideas. Even revolution itself was a fusion process. American republicanism did not discard monarchy's symbolic gravity or religious moral framing. It reconfigured them into participatory legitimacy. The Enlightenment believed that strength came not from purification, but from integration of contrasting materials. The ability to host multiple truths without collapsing them into a single dogma was considered a virtue, not a weakness. In the Illuminati warning, combination is not prevented by lack of materials, it is blocked by design. The triad of contrast, overlap, and fusion remains in structure, but is perverted in function, turning the engine of synthesis into a machinery of strategic division. Contrast is no longer the differentiation that enables meaningful recombination. It is reframed as essential conflict. Distinctions of race, class, ideology, or religion are exaggerated, reified, and turned into identity fortresses. Under apartheid South Africa, racial categories were used not to understand difference, but to harden it into law, preventing any mutual transformation across lines. In colonial India, the British exaggerated religious divisions between Hindus and Muslims, solidifying communal boundaries to stymie unified resistance. Overlap, the space where shared engagement allows exchange, is then deliberately obstructed. Interaction is surveilled, mistrusted, or punished. In authoritarian regimes, institutions that once bridged social differences, universities, trade unions, civic spaces, are stripped of autonomy or flooded with propaganda, destroying the capacity for cross-cutting recombination. Fusion, the emergence of something new from structured difference, is now treated as corruption or ideological impurity. Under fascist regimes, hybridity is framed as decay. Mixed heritage, blended ideologies, or international alliances are viewed as threats to national or racial purity. The result is a system that maintains the external posture of pluralism, many identities, many parties, many voices, but ensures that none of them can meaningfully interact. Combination still exists, but as a trap. Every part is kept isolated, every alliance preemptively poisoned. The system enforces the conditions of recomposition, but denies the payoff. This is the core of the distortion. Difference is retained only to be manipulated. Overlap is simulated, but inert. Fusion is forbidden. What should be the engine of transformation becomes a labyrinth of partitions. Governance ceases to evolve, not because it lacks inputs, but because it has built a firewall against its own future. All authority seeks durability, but enforcement alone cannot produce it. For governance to persist across time, it must cultivate association, the slow construction of bonds that outlast any single encounter or transaction. These bonds emerge from three interlocking dynamics: contact, which initiates relation; memory, which preserves it; and reciprocity, which stabilizes it through return. Together, these form the social substrate upon which formal institutions depend. A law is only as stable as the culture that remembers why it matters. A state is only as secure as the ties that connect its people across lines of class, geography, or generation. Without association, society becomes a collection of strangers. With it, cooperation becomes habit, and trust becomes infrastructure. Governing systems cannot invent cohesion on command. They must build it patiently through relational scaffolding that binds past, present, and future into mutual recognition. So this triad is composed of contact, memory, and reciprocity. Contact initiates the relationship, whether through shared space, action, or dialogue. Memory accumulates the meaning of those interactions, building trust, obligation, or identity across time. Reciprocity turns these remembered contacts into stable patterns, reinforcing expectations of mutual response. The three together transform isolated moments into enduring social infrastructure. If contact is missing, association never forms. If memory is absent, contact becomes forgettable. If reciprocity fails, memory becomes suspicion or grievance rather than connection. Association thus describes more than linkage. It describes sustainable relationality, the repeated, remembered, and returned engagements that make societies cohesive. It models how groups cohere not by force or command, but through networks of loyalty, recognition, and shared consequence. This understanding was central to Enlightenment social theory. Association was recognized as a source of civic strength and an antidote to despotism. From the Scottish Enlightenment to Tocqueville's observations of America, the presence of clubs, societies, volunteer groups, salons, and civic organizations was seen not as ornamentation, but as the circulatory system of liberty. These associations preserved social memory, recording past collaborations, preserving local traditions, enabling intergenerational knowledge transfer. More importantly, they trained people in reciprocal governance, in taking responsibility, responding to others, and negotiating difference. The Enlightenment insight was that freedom is not simply the absence of tyranny. It is the presence of associational life strong enough to resist it. A society rich in associations creates layers of defense between individual and state, not through violence, but through solidarity. In the Illuminati warning, the triad of association, contact, memory, reciprocity, is not merely absent, but actively distorted, producing isolation under the illusion of connection. Contact, once the basis for trust through shared space and repeated encounter, becomes shallow and fragmented. In totalitarian regimes like East Germany, trust was shattered through informant networks, where even the most intimate relationships could be weaponized by the state. Today, the same effect is produced not through overt surveillance, but through digital architecture. Social media platforms maximize exposure while minimizing continuity. People encounter hundreds of others daily, but rarely in ways that build trust. The algorithm favors novelty over familiarity, performance over relationship. Memory, once the storehouse of shared experience, is overwritten or fractured. Under regimes like Pinochet's Chile or China's Cultural Revolution, history was manipulated or erased to sever generational continuity. Online, memory becomes ephemeral, feeds update by the second, archives are buried, and collective experience is replaced by trending fragments. Nothing sticks, which means nothing strengthens. Reciprocity, which once stabilized social life through mutual reinforcement, is now conditioned by metrics and monetization. Every interaction is scored, surveilled, and optimized, not for solidarity, but for engagement and extraction. Likes replace loyalty. Influence replaces intimacy. In both historical and digital contexts, the distortion hollows out association from the inside. The result is not merely loneliness, but disarmament, a population that cannot remember, cannot rely, and cannot respond. The Enlightenment saw association as the invisible scaffolding of free society. The distortion replaces it with a mirror maze, visible, crowded, but directionless. And a society without durable association is one where power does not need to repress. It only needs to interrupt. Every governing system eventually confronts the need for coherence. It is not enough to wield power, to distribute resources, or even to enable participation. If the people within a society cannot understand their position, what they are supposed to do, how they relate to others, and why any of it matters, the system decays into confusion. Integration addresses this problem. It aligns internal functions, institutions, and interpretations into a pattern that is not only operational, but intelligible. A society needs more than efficiency. It needs legibility. It needs its roles to be comprehensible, its structures to be navigable, and its meanings to be shareable. Integration is not the elimination of conflict, but the synchronization of contradiction into an understandable and livable order. Without it, even freedom becomes unrecognizable. This final triad links role, structure, and meaning into a system of justified order. A role gives an individual or institution a defined function: citizen, judge, teacher, journalist, minister, and outlines the expectations of action. A structure arranges those roles into stable patterns of interaction, governed by rules, authority, or tradition. Courts check executives, journalists investigate officials, citizens vote or resist. Meaning connects the first two to a cultural and moral narrative. It explains why the role matters and why the structure is legitimate. When all three align, a society can argue with itself productively. People know what they are, where they stand, and why the game is worth playing. Remove role, and people drift into cynicism. Remove structure, and institutions fail to coordinate or constrain. Remove meaning, and the system becomes alienated from its own participants. Integration does not erase conflict, it makes it livable. The Enlightenment pursued integration through legibility and purpose. It created institutions that did not just function, but meant something. Constitutions turned abstract values into formal structures. Education systems trained citizens not only to obey, but to understand. Law was made transparent and courts public. Bureaucracies were built to be predictable, so that individual roles could be trusted across time. A teacher knew what it meant to teach in a republic. A judge knew why independence mattered. A voter knew what their ballot represented. Enlightenment thinkers understood that societies could not survive on obedience alone. People must see how they fit in. They must be able to interpret the system they live within, not as chaos, not as mystery, but as a structure with purpose. Integration was never perfection, it was continuity through legibility. A coherent society could disagree with itself without falling apart. In the Illuminati warning, the triad of integration, role, structure, meaning, does not vanish. It collapses inward, producing a society that still looks organized, but has lost the capacity to orient itself. Role survives only as performance. Citizens still vote, teachers still teach, judges still judge, but none of these functions carry reliable agency or intelligible consequence. In late imperial Rome, public offices retained their titles long after they had ceased to operate. Administrators bore responsibilities they could not fulfill, while real power shifted to unelected generals and private patronage networks. In modern failing states, the same hollowing occurs. Ministries exist in name, but authority is exercised informally by oligarchs, militias, or foreign sponsors. People continue to enact the motions of civic life, but with no sense of efficacy. Structure, instead of coordinating these roles into predictable patterns, becomes contradictory, opaque, or purely ceremonial. The Soviet Union in its last decades maintained the architecture of councils, committees, and courts, yet decision-making was driven by invisible factions, personal loyalties, and institutional paralysis. Structure remained visible, yet it no longer structured anything. Meaning, the narrative that once explained why the system existed at all, becomes the first casualty. Competing myths, state propaganda, conspiracy narratives, and cynicism fill the void where coherent public purpose once lived. Under the later Ottoman Empire, centuries of mismatched reforms, contradictory legal codes, and warring ideological currents left populations with overlapping and incompatible meanings of their own society. When meaning fractures, even functioning institutions feel alien. People no longer believe the roles they inhabit or the structures they move within. They do not rebel, they drift. Historically, this is not merely political decay, it is civilizational unmooring. The Western Roman Empire collapsed not when its army failed, but when its integration failed, Roman roles, citizen, taxpayer, soldier, Roman structures, courts, forums, road networks, and Roman meanings, imperial unity, shared identity, and civic virtue, no longer aligned. People ceased to understand what Rome was or why it mattered. And once meaning vanished, loyalty followed. In post-Yugoslav states, the rapid dissolution of shared meaning, national identity, civic fraternity, socialist solidarity, left intact institutions that could no longer hold their societies together. Courts existed, parliaments existed, police forces existed, yet none could command legitimacy because roles, structures, and meanings had unraveled. Society did not simply weaken, it shattered into mutually unintelligible worlds. This is the deepest warning encoded in the negated triad. When integration fails, power does not disappear, it metastasizes. Informal networks replace formal institutions. Myth replaces explanation. Identity replaces citizenship. Paranoia replaces interpretation. People begin to live inside separate realities, and governance becomes a battle not over policy, but over orientation itself. This is why the Illuminati story becomes attractive in such moments. It gives a simple explanation where meaning has collapsed, a single actor where structure has disintegrated, a hidden plan where roles no longer make sense. The myth fills the vacuum created by disintegration. But the true danger is not that secret elites control the system. It is that the system has become so incoherent that only a myth seems capable of holding its pieces together. Integration is the final triad for a reason. It is the difference between a society that can locate itself and act, and a society that cannot remember how to stand. When its negation succeeds, the collapse is total. The machine continues to run, but absent law, morality, or basic respect for human life. The point of this work is not just to expose a hidden ruling class, it is to remove the illusion that one is required. Once you understand the 11 triads, the Illuminati stops appearing as a supernatural engine of domination and start revealing themselves as a map of structural failure. Each distortion follows a pattern. Disagreement is reframed as manipulation, feedback as obedience, causality as blame, emergence as preordained fate, inclusion as inner circle, coordination as control, harmony as silence, shared reality as illusion, synthesis as division, association as alienation, integration as simulation. These are not mystic powers, they are methods of control that lead to catastrophe, and they succeed because we've forgotten how to see them coming. That is why this isn't just an explanation. It's a tool. The triads are not symbols. They are diagnostics. They let you read the behavior of power without waiting for revelations or scandals. You can look at how systems manage contradiction, adjust to error, assign responsibility, and support participation, and ask the most important question: is this structure still designed to survive by correction? Or has it started to protect itself through illusion? That shift is visible. You don't need to believe in the Illuminati to see it. You just need language for what breaks when real power disappears behind performance. This is the mistake the modern world keeps making. Leaders see the myth of the Illuminati as a guide and try to rule through secrecy, simulation, and control. Citizens see the same myth and assume nothing can be understood, let alone repaired. But read properly, the legend becomes useful again. It becomes a set of warnings about how authority fails, warnings that can be seen early and named out loud. When feedback is gone, when trust is simulated, when participation is emptied, when stories replace systems, these are not signs of omnipotence. They are signs of a system approaching collapse. If you know what you're looking at, you can do more than watch. You can object with force and clarity before the architecture of failure locks into place. The original Illuminati hoped to warn against unaccountable power. Their tragedy was believing a warning could survive in secrecy. This work restores that warning by making it unmistakably public. The danger isn't that shadow power rules the world. The danger is that too many people now believe it must, and start acting accordingly. But once the spell breaks, once you see that the patterns aren't magic but engineering flaws, You don't have to mythologize power or mystify resistance. You can name the error, you can build the opposite, you can stop the inversion before it becomes irreversible. The myth gave us a monster in the dark. The warning gives us a mirror. What we do next is the part they couldn't script.